Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the second workshop in our 2021 REU Summer Series. First, I'd just like to start off with a few housekeeping bits today. We will have a question and answer portion at the end. You are able to put any of your questions in the chat, and we will kind of go through those and call on individuals if you wanted to ask your question verbally as well. Additionally, the session will be recorded. However, only the speaker will be shown during that recording. So if you do unmute or turn your video on anytime, you will not be captured in the recording as well. Additionally, just as a reminder, we do have another workshop that will be held next week. And that will be an intermediate Python workshop as well. I will add the link in the chat for you all to be able to go to the student resources page so that you can see information on that, as well as be able to register for the additional events in the series. And so with that, I am going to welcome our speaker today. Today we have the pleasure of having Courtney Au-Yeung. Courtney graduated with her PhD in physics last May from Lehigh University and is currently working as a research staff member at the Institute for Defense Analysis in Alexandria, Virginia. So thank you for joining us today, Courtney.
Thank you for having me. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. All right, so as Brianne had just mentioned, so my name is Courtney Au-Yeung. So I am part of the ethics committee for APS. I've been on it for the past 3 years now, helping out with APS ethics related policies. So the first thing I wanted to go over is the APS ethics guidelines. So I don't know how many people have, if you can show a raise of hands, but how many people have actually heard of or read these guidelines? Okay, I see at least one, so that's good. Okay, let me bring up. So if you can either unmute or put it in the chat, I'm just opening up the chat on my end. So what types of issues or policies do you think that the guidelines should address? And then we'll go over each section briefly. So you can either unmute or put it in the chat. Plagiarism, yep, that's super important. Discrimination, definitely. All right, so the first section, actually, somebody hit right on the head, that it is the research record and publications. So that does have to do with plagiarism, that has to do with research results. So that's making sure that you are honest, as Jonathan just mentioned, that you can't falsify, you can't fabricate your data, omit data just because you don't like it, cherry picking and things of that nature. That also covers things like redundant publications. So that's when a research group or a researcher essentially publishes the same set of data in 2 or more papers just to increase their publication record. It also has to do with peer review, so making sure that you follow the full peer review standards and when publishing in a journal, and references in the scientific communication. So that's making sure that you're giving credit where credit is due when it comes to publishing. The next section of the guidelines talks about policies for handling allegations of research misconduct. So the American Physical Society does not have our own, we can't reside over any sort of issues that happen at a specific institution, but as APS members, that we hold ourselves to the standards of our institution. So we need to make sure that each institution organization has those rules and that we are following them. And if we witness anything when it comes to research ethics or harassment or things of that nature, that we're making sure that we're acting in accordance with the institutional requirements. So next came up a couple times in the chat as well. So this is the treatment of colleagues and subordinates. So what this has to do is exactly is treating people respectfully and correctly. So that has to do with explicit, systemic, and implicit bias. So that is bias on the basis of race, color, national origin, sex, religion, disability, age, or gender identity. So that is the number one under that section. Additionally, this covers harassment, the treatment of subordinates. So that can either be an advisor to an advisee, that can be a graduate student to an undergraduate student, just any sort of subordinate relationship. And then that's also the code of conduct for meetings. So that's most important for American Physical Society. We do have a code of conduct and how we expect all members to act at meetings. Finally, there's the responsibilities to the profession. So what this has to do with, this is when you post on social media. So this is making sure that as a scientist that you're posting accurate and non-misleading information. This is the ethical use of public funds. This is primarily more for a PI or something rather than a researcher. This is making sure that when you receive a grant or something that is going to the objective that you originally signed up for, and that's the funds are coming with the expectation the funds are spent in the manner that upholds the public trust. And this also has to do with, I think Madeline had mentioned, conflicts of interest and commitment. And then the last section is improving the education for professional ethics standards and practices. So this is something that the ethics committee has put a lot of time in. So we're doing things like this webinar where we're helping to create official ethics education in both through APS and then also working with institutions. So the APS Ethics Committee was established in 2018, and we help to oversee the implementation of ethics policies for APS to regularly review and update the community on ethics-based practices and to organize events and materials related to ethics education, like this webinar. So you can contact the Ethics Committee at this email address. It's ethics@aps.org. And then you can ask questions. We can help provide guidance, or if you experience an ethical violation or have a question on that, we can help point you to the right resources on who you should contact in next steps. If anything ever happens at an APS event, you can report incidents at aps.ethicspoint.com. This can be found on the APS Ethics webpage. So if you search American Physical Society Ethics Committee or ethics, you can see the ethics program page. And then Ethics Point is a confidential site. So you don't have to have your name associated with the report. And then someone will reach out to you within 24 hours for help. So does anybody have any questions on the guidelines or the committee before we move on to go over some case studies? Okay. So our first case study has to do with data acquisition. So you're a graduate student working in a lab where data is accumulated for the purposes of measuring optical absorption of a variety of samples. For each sample, there's a large data file stored on a computer in the lab. In reviewing a lab notebook from one of your predecessors and comparing that data to data published by the lab, you find a gap. That is, some of the data that were published are not accounted for in the lab notebook. Furthermore, you're unable to locate the computer files for this missing data. You talk to a fellow graduate student about this situation, and he tells you that you should be very concerned about the situation that should be reported. So thinking of this situation, the questions, we're going to put you in breakout rooms, and I'd want everyone to talk about what are possible situations that could explain this missing data, and for each situation, how would you proceed? So we're going to give you guys 5 minutes to talk, and then we'll come together as a group.
Looks like everyone's back.
Okay. All right, so if anybody wants to unmute and give possible scenarios that could explain why some of that data is missing. If you want to write in the chat, I can also say it.
Our group basically just concluded that there's probably some sort of faking of data going on here. So the predecessor probably didn't have the data necessary for publication, and he felt that it was necessary that he had to fake the data because he wanted that recognition. So it's pretty serious.
Absolutely. So that is one of the scenarios that I also came up with, and that the missing data didn't actually exist and it was faked. So that would be a major misconduct. What about, let's see, Megan in the chat said that it might have been taken at a different facility and offloaded to another location. So those are two of the very realistic scenarios. So one is obviously a source of major misconduct, but then what do you guys think if the missing data was actually just taken at another location, was stored in a different area, or maybe a different student had taken that and it was only in their data notebook? Paul had said using data from literature but forgetting citations. Yep, that would also be a reason why maybe the data can be there. So of those scenarios, something like the missing data being acquired by a different facility or somebody else and not showing up necessarily in that stored shared lab computer. So that's not necessarily an ethical violation, but that's still a serious issue in record keeping. So that's just showing that proper use of lab notebooks and understanding how to properly store data. That's something that is very important, especially in as a graduate student or an REU student, where once you're gone for the summer, people need to be able to find your data to have a reputable data source. But things like falsification of data, that turns into a serious data misconduct. So that's something that you would have to probably report it to a higher level. But at that point, if we're just from looking at a shared computer, if you notice something missing, it's possible that it's still a record keeping issue. So that's something that at that point, you might not know the full story. Does anyone know who you would talk to if you think that data was falsified?
Would you go to academic integrity, or would you go to your like research assistant or like research mentor first?
So those are two really great options. So if you don't feel comfortable going to, if you have a misconduct policy officer or an academic integrity office, you can go to your research assistant and then maybe talk to your advisor and then talk to the department head. So you can do essentially in steps if you don't want to go straight to the misconduct. But the worst thing that can happen is it's better to be, I think, a little bit more careful rather than less. So that's something that if you don't feel comfortable going straight to the academic integrity office, starting off with your research assistant or your advisor would be a great place.
Could we also like go to the person who took the data in the first place and just kind of talk to them about it? Because another situation that our group came up with was like perhaps the person made a mistake, and then because of the mistake they made, they didn't record it in the lab notebook.
Yeah, that's actually a very good observation as well. Because I know I was in an experimental lab. There was definitely times where my data run just didn't quite work out. So maybe I didn't save it, but still had it numbered or something like that. So it looked like it's missing. So you could absolutely go to them directly and just ask like, oh, I noticed that there was some data missing. Do you know where it is? Or do you know what happened to that data run?
Like the data can also be like kind of nested inside of the paper and some like obscure reference, because I had to go through some papers before to find like carbon data, and I couldn't find any of it. So I had to like email the person, and they said, oh, if you just look at the supplementary data and you go to this reference and then that reference has another reference, and then it's like, so I think going to the person first might be better because, benefit of the doubt.
Absolutely. And I think you raise a really great point that came up in the ethics guidelines, is making sure that you're correctly citing is so important. So just because maybe you read the molecule structure from a different paper, but that they cited someone who cited someone, it might be better to just do that digging as an author and cite directly. But yeah, I think that's a great idea. Carol had mentioned that improper naming convention can also affect the location of data. Absolutely. I know, especially if you're running stuff through code, sometimes if there's a space or a wrong underscore or something like that, it can absolutely get lost. All right, that was a great discussion. Okay, let's go to the next case. This has to do with mentoring. So you're a student from a very small undergraduate institution accepted for a graduate study at a prestigious university. Your first year is covered by a scholarship. When you arrive, your advisors place you in the standard first year classes, but you're doubtful about your background. So we're going to break you out into breakout rooms again. And then there's two things you want to ask is if you're a student who's not entirely sure about their background at a first year at a prestigious university, taking those standard first year classes, what are some things you would do? And then what are questions that potentially an outside observer might ask? And then George, legal consequences for this kind of misconduct. So I'm not an expert on that, but I would think if you are falsifying data, especially there are going to be legal concerns, especially if you're using that data to get a grant or something like that. I think that certainly that would definitely fall in sketchy territory. Awesome. All right, so let's break this up into two sections. So first, as a student going from a smaller undergraduate institution and being dumped into a bigger school in the first year grad classes, I know for me that was a very big jump. What are possible options you think that you could take or people you could reach out to?
I mean, I think first off, one of the best things that you could do is, as a student, your responsibility being to just reach out to your advisors and expressing that, you know, this is what's going on and this is how you feel and how you could get help for it.
Yeah, I think that is a great place to start. I know I'm not sure if it'll be covered in any of the REU chats, but I know it's called imposter syndrome, where you feel like you're way out of your league when you first get to grad school. That's something that's super common. Emily also mentioned talk to your advisors. I think that's a great place to start, especially because that's someone you're probably semi-comfortable with and someone that you're they are looking out for your best interests as well. Are there any other options that you can think of to help ease that transition?
You could preemptively take like a class over the summer or like an online thing over the summer before you go to graduate school.
Yeah, absolutely. One other option that's similar to that is that you could potentially take some advanced undergrad classes as a mix in your first year classes. So I know I went to Lehigh University, and there is one course that you can opt out of. It's more of like I can't quite remember what the course was, but it's like a modern physics type thing, and it's an advanced undergrad / graduate class. You could take classes like that are can help boost your background a little bit more. Let's see. Jonathan had mentioned that to work with classmates if they're struggling, it can ease your feeling of being isolated. Absolutely. I think working in groups and solving problems together is a great way to get to know your cohort, but also help you feel more comfortable in your classes.
What about talking to your teacher?
Yeah, I think reaching out to the professor directly, that's a great idea. It's something that there might even just be something small that you're not quite understanding, and it could be cleared up to give you that basis to succeed for the rest of your course. And they can also maybe provide supplemental materials that could help.
Is transfer shock also a thing when you go to graduate school?
I haven't heard that term, but I mean, I can imagine.
Well, at Rutgers, they basically say if you're a transfer student, there's a thing called transfer shock. So you shouldn't take like a whole bunch of classes your first semester if you transferred. Because like statistically, you do worse your first year as a transfer student than if someone were to come as a first year at Rutgers.
I could see that. I think one of the biggest differences that I found going from undergraduates to graduate school is that you actually take less classes than you did in undergrad, but they're harder. You're doing research on top of that, so it takes up more. So it's a different time management than before. So I don't know I think that transition, probably there is definitely a period where you're just kind of trying to find your equilibrium and work things out. And I think that would happen if you're coming from a small school to a big school, or just that transition from undergrad to graduate school in general. So the second scenario would be what are questions that an outside observer might ask? So someone who isn't that student that feels like they might not have the right background.
Is this where the ethical aspect comes in?
Yeah.
Because we were trying to figure that out.
Yes. Yeah, this one was a little
Maybe
bit. Go ahead.
Maybe an outside observer might ask, well, what are their qualifications? Like, can we see like their resume or transcript, just to make sure that like we know that they definitely deserve to be here and that there isn't anything like faked or shady going on?
Absolutely. So something if it was a student that was accepted with a poor background, that's something that an outside observer could ask. One of the ethical dilemmas is the balance between wanting a diverse cohort and also making sure that everyone is properly prepared. So you don't want to throw people into a situation that they cannot handle or without the proper support. Jonathan had asked why they're receiving a scholarship. Absolutely. So there's a variety of reasons you could be receiving a scholarship. It's not necessarily always academic based. So that's something that it might be a student that needs the additional support. So as a first year counselor or first year advisor, you need to make sure that all of your students are receiving the proper amount of support that they need to succeed. And then the last kind of question that they had come up with is that how can you tell that a student is underprepared without them reaching out? So as advisors or as counselors and mentors, like what are the signs to know that if a student is struggling, and kind of why do you think they are, and what resources can you provide to help? All right. So our next study has to do with back in the lab. So hazardous materials. A condensed matter experimentalist and his students were conducting experiments on thin films of common metals such as aluminum and tin. They realized that they could substantially enhance their work by switching the samples to the metal beryllium, which is highly toxic and can bring irreversible poisoning. The procedures they are employing with aluminum and tin would not be suitable for the toxic material. So in your breakout rooms, I want you guys to think about what are the responsibilities that the PI has when considering a possibly toxic and dangerous material, and then what roles do the students have? If there's a decision to go ahead with the hazardous material, what is the PI's responsibility? And then how would you set up a lab with a new material?
What is the PI?
So the PI is a principal investigator. So that would be the advisor, like the professor who's in charge of the lab. All right, so it looks like we're getting a little bit short on time for the question session, but so first if anyone has ideas on what responsibility does the investigator have when considering a new potentially toxic material or potentially hazardous material?
I'm pretty sure the PA would probably have to like restructure the whole research around the fact that it's now like really dangerous. So probably some new like, I don't know, some new like equipment to handle something like that would probably be, some funding would probably need to be changed a little bit too.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the biggest things that they need to make sure that that their current lab can handle that new material. So yep. Hazardous waste training, absolutely. And then considering new procedures and changes to the lab. So they need to make sure that they have all of the proper safety equipment and then also have the right type of fume hoods and everything like that. So it could potentially be a restructuring of the lab itself. What roles do you think the students would have in making this decision?
They should definitely be like informed of like what's being considered and like what sort of changes would be made to accommodate this and what risks are posed to them. And I think at the individual level, they should be able to like opt out if they don't want to put themselves in harm's way if something doesn't seem up to code.
Absolutely. So I think that that's exactly what I came up with, that they need to make sure that they are appropriately trained to use that new material, and then they need to make sure that they're comfortable with that. And if they don't feel comfortable working with a hazardous material, they should still have other research avenues available. So it shouldn't have to make or break their research experience. So if there is a decision to go ahead with the work, what is the PI's responsibility in terms of providing information and training? So we went over this a little bit, and also a couple people in the chat have mentioned. But yeah, new procedures and changes to the lab, and then making sure that everybody is comfortable and has the proper training. The other thing that I had come up with is that, especially when you're first starting to work with that substance, the principal investigator needs to make sure that they're able to supervise and until the students and the other researchers feel comfortable working with the new material. And the last question, I think we also kind of went over already. How should he or she proceed with setting up these new experiments in a manner that would ensure the safety of the students? Yep, Carol, absolutely. They need to confirm that everyone is properly trained. So whether that's demonstrating and what everyone's watching on top of the hazardous materials training that a research institution would supply, and then also making sure that everybody has the proper safety equipment and the different PPE that's necessary for the lab. Logging in files, yep, definitely. One thing, especially, is not only when you're working with the materials, you need to make sure that you're following all the correct procedures, but also for storing them. So I know in certain labs, depending on what materials you're working with, not all chemicals and not all metal materials can be stored in the same way. So you need to make sure that all of those proper safety precautions are in place. All right, so we are at 142, so I am going to skip the next case study. So like I had mentioned, the APS Ethics program ethics page does have all of these case studies. So if you're looking for more, if you're wanting to give a similar presentation or share with others, that they have, I think, over 20 different case studies or something like that. It's very extensive, and they have it both for students as well as I think professors as well. All right, so I can take any questions. If I don't know the answer, I should be able to direct you to somebody who can answer anything ethics related, whether they're on the committee or through APS.
So sometimes I hear a lot about like ethics in respect to science in like a biological or like psychological sort of studies and stuff like that. Are there any like real notable ones you can think of with people where it's not necessarily like procedural, but like the aims of the experiment themselves might not be ethical?
I'm trying to, so as far as like, obviously in a physics lab, we rarely have human subjects and things of that nature. So I think that's typically what comes to mind when it comes to research ethical violations. But as far as like a big physics related thing is that incident, I guess. I think it was actually back in the 90s, but it was at Bell Labs, and they had found out there was a huge amount of, I think it was cherry picking data, if I am remembering correctly, but that was actually one of the big reasons why the American Physical Society had a survey, and that was to early career physicists to really understand the different research ethical violations and things of that nature. And we actually just reran that survey for this last year, actually, for graduate students to help understand what are the type of research and also like how people are treating subordinates and things like that. Like what are the different research and ethical violations that graduate students see. And that was we saw a lot of different survey answers from being pressured to publish, so falsifying data in order to be able to publish, subordinates that not being treated fairly as a graduate student, or cherry picking data, like creating your own story without actually having the research to back it up. So I think that's more of the violations that we typically see.
I have a question. Are environmental impacts and like pollution, especially with experiments that might generate hazardous waste, considered in the ethical guidelines?
I'm actually not sure. I'd have to reread the full guidelines. I know in at least within the sections, I'm not entirely sure if it is directly called out in the guidelines, but I think that that's definitely something important. That's something that could absolutely be a case study or a resource on the ethics page. Someone in the chat had a great point that for physics education research, there is a lot of human research that they need to consider. So that is something that is that has to do with human subjects if they're collecting data in their classes, and then bridge programs will engage in research and other programs that students actually participate in the research. Thank you.
A huge ethical issue in physics and other like branches of science is also how you present your data to the public.
Absolutely.
Like there was this problem several years ago where Italy wanted to jail some geologists because they reported their findings on some seismic activity, and the public didn't think it was like much it was much to worry about because they presented it just like as they would to their other colleagues, and so no one really did anything, and then buildings toppled, people were hurt, and the government kind of blamed the geologists because they didn't really convey the urgency of the situation.
Absolutely. I think that is a huge consideration too for kind of what for the section of our professional responsibilities as a scientist. And I think that that's a point where for at least scientific journals, that the peer review process is so important to make sure that people are putting out good research that's backed by data. But I hadn't heard of that. That's really interesting.
There's also like the flip side where like a few years ago, like someone was working at a particle accelerator and they discovered that they can create miniature black holes. Like they were like so small that like they just evaporate instantly. They're not like dangerous, but like the public and the governments got involved and they're like, oh, they're going to create a black hole. It's going to swallow up the earth. So they had to like republish another paper to describe how it's not dangerous. So like that was pretty interesting.
Absolutely. I think social media definitely plays a huge factor into that because everybody wants the flashy headlines, things like that. So that's something that you need to be careful of, is when you're sharing things on social media, that it still needs to be factual. We still need to support like the clear conclusions.
Yeah, it's like people also like don't really understand like some of the stuff that's going on. So when they think of black hole, they think, oh, something's just going to eat up the world. But these black holes last for like fractions of like a microsecond. Like they're not even like observable. Like so.
Absolutely.
We still have about 11 minutes if anyone has any additional questions at all. And of course, if not, we won't hold you.
I have another question. Do you have any ethical dilemmas you faced personally and had to resolve that you could share with us?
Yeah, so I haven't had as much like research violations or anything of that nature. Like I've seen before, there's been times where I had to back up my data if the conclusion didn't necessarily show what previous group members had seen. So maybe I had taken new data and it didn't necessarily match the same conclusion. So there was no ethical violations that actually occurred. It was just, it ended up just being a difference in experimental setups. I had just used slightly different conditions and it vastly changed the conclusions that I had made from what I was expecting. But I personally haven't witnessed any misconduct or research allegations. I know that I had helped to review the survey. I had seen just like a preview of the data, and I think that that's certainly not the norm. I think a lot of people do witness different ethical violations, but I have also definitely seen, especially friends of mine who have gone on to fairly, like a lot of the bigger institutions, there is a huge pressure to publish. So I think that a lot of times puts a lot of pressure on the students to make sure that they're able to publish. But I haven't myself seen any serious misconduct, luckily.
Thank you.
No problem.
I want possibly to make a comment. In my subgroup, I noticed that the students have a tendency to say that they would turn toward their friends or their family, and they are not aware to the fact that every single university, large or small, has, for what concerned hazardous waste and handling of things that are potentially toxic, they have a health and safety group. For things that concerns publications and so on, they have published rules of how they handle intellectual properties and so on. So there is in every university a set of guidelines that are available at the tip of the finger through the computer. And I'm surprised that this is not something that students should be trained on. And I guess this is the venue where we should point that to them.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point. And that's something that we've discussed in the ethics committee, is that a lot of students haven't had a formal ethics training, whether that's in a class or something even more formal than this webinar. But like the resources are out there, and it's just that there isn't a lot of experience with people having like a formal ethics class and things of that nature. So I think that's something that would be a great addition to a course curriculum. There's a question in the chat. Famously, physics has been responsible for some of the most powerful, devastating, and history-changing ways. With this in mind, what are the ethical responsibilities physicists have when choosing what research to do, where to do it, and whose funding to pursue? That is a great question, and I don't know if I really have the answer to that. Yeah, I think that is something that's definitely a thought-provoking question. I think that's something that's important, especially when you think of the people who choose to go into industry or basic science. Like they're all equally important. How do you choose what is the most important? I don't think I have a good answer for that, but I will certainly think on that. Absolutely. That's a great question.
And I want to add another comment here. Again, I worked with Glenn Seaborg, who discovered plutonium, and of course was one of the scientists who was at the source of some history-changing things as well. And what he did is spend the rest of his life, when he was much more senior and had definitely more power of say and doing, of working on non-proliferation issues. So this, I guess, when he did his research, I don't think he was being stopped by or slowed down by any ethical point of view, especially since it was in the middle of World War II. But ethics in mind made him choose things he did later in his life and dedicated his life to non-proliferation.
Yeah, that's awesome. Absolutely.
Just an example.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great example. Yeah, so on this slide I've left, that's my email address. If you think of anything or need somebody to point you to the right resource, you could also reach out to the ethics committee. There's also an email for that, but any last questions?
Okay. All right. It seems like all the questions have come to an end, but I do want to thank you all for attending today. I think it was definitely great discussions. And I want to definitely thank Courtney. This was an excellent presentation and talk on this. And I think it definitely generated a lot of good discussion and questions. Just as a reminder to you all, there is another event. I'm sorry, I misspoke in the beginning and said it was next week. It's actually July 1st. From 1 to 3 p.m. It will be the part 2 of the Python workshop if you did attend that on June 10th. And so this will be the intermediate Python workshop that will be available on July 1st from 1 to 3 as well. And so I hope you all will attend that also. There is a website that is available that I'll put in the chat now, where you'll be able to access all of the student resources as well as register for a different additional workshops that will be available this summer. But once again, thank you, Courtney, and thank you all for attending today. Have a great day.